Welcome to the Ed Bargy video series. This series here will be on braking. First we're going to cover straight line braking. Then we'll get into maybe the techniques for advanced braking or braking into the turn, such as trail braking. Before we get into the specifics, here's just a quick little video showing the results of good aggressive braking going into a very tight turn. There is one more little thing you might notice in this example is the gear selection for the corner. With the proper gear selection, you get a real good drive off the turn also. So looking at this silhouette of a motorcycle, we're going to imagine it's going down a nice long fast straightaway. All the force being developed to push that motorcycle forward is through the rear wheel. So we got a lot of thrust at the contact patch of the rear wheel pushing the motorcycle forward. Before we can actually look at the technique to get the brakes applied and be aggressive on the brakes and maintaining control, we need to look at the forces and the dynamics working on the bike at the point that we want to apply the brakes. Now, to generate this thrust, this acceleration down the straightaway, the engine has to be generating a lot of torque, especially if the rider's running full throttle, and this torque is applied to the rear wheel. Well, because of that, there's a counter torque, which the engine and everything is actually trying to rotate the nose of the bike upward. And if enough horsepower is applied, the bike would actually start the wheelie. So in this condition, you can think about, with that torque applied, what is that doing to the weight and load on the front tire? And as you can see here, as you apply more and more torque, the weight on the front wheel gets reduced. So there's less and less weight on the front wheel as you're accelerating down the straightaway. Another force acting on the bike, is very often overlooked, is aerodynamic drag. Now, the faster you go, the higher this drag force gets. A motorcycle has a fairly large frontal area up high, so the biggest portion of the aerodynamic drag is up high on the motorcycle. But if you notice, the thrust pushing the motorcycle forward is down low, but the aerodynamic drag is up high, holding the bike back. This in itself is going to cause a rotational force or a torque trying to make the bike rotate upward, once again adding to the tendency to wheelie, and this in itself will also reduce the weight on the front wheel. So the overall result with these forces and these torques acting on the chassis, when you get to the end of the straightaway, you're going to have a very limited weight on that front wheel. One other thing we need to take into consideration about the front wheel before we start looking at how to brake. As you look at the bike going down a nice long straightaway and the bike running at full tilt boogie, throttle wide open, the rear tire is doing all the work. So that tire is nice and warm. The front tire going in the straight line is doing very little work, very little load, and at this point has very little weight on it. So you can imagine what the compound of that front tire is starting to do. It's actually starting to cool off. So a nice long fast straightaway, you might have a front tire that's a little cooler than you expected. So the result is you've got a tire with very little weight on it and a cooler compound. So that would mean you have probably a little less traction than you would expect at that point on the track. Well, one aspect of this is almost automatic, because at the end of the straightaway you're going to be rolling off the throttle. So at that point the rider will smoothly roll off the throttle from full throttle to fully closed and get that weight on the nose. Now that you've rolled off the throttle, yes, you've put more weight on the front wheel from that, but still, remember, your tire is still not as warm as you probably would like. So instead of reaching up and grabbing a whole handful of brake and snatching that brake on as full and hard as possible all at once, I'm going to use a more progressive approach. What I would do initially is reach up, put enough squeeze on the front brake to effectively turn the brake light on for a split second, and then immediately after that I start squeezing in some brake pressure. As I put in some brake pressure, that's going to cause a drag on the front wheel, a braking drag at the contact patch, trying to slow the bike down. Well, the inertia of the bike, the inertia of the center of mass of the bike is going to continue forward and try to keep the bike going forward as fast as possible. Now you're going to use the drag of the front wheel to start slowing the bike down. Well, the drag on the front wheel is down low at the pavement, but the center of gravity is up a lot higher. So one's going one way, one's going the other way. The two opposing forces are going to actually cause a rotational force on the chassis. And this rotational force is going to transfer weight of the bike to the front wheel. And as you transfer more weight to the front wheel, that's going to put more grip between the wheel and the pavement. Once you get a little more grip from braking, because of the weight transfer, that gives you the ability to squeeze in a little more front brake, which in turn transfers more weight to the front wheel, which translates to more friction, which allows you to progressively put in more brake, etc., etc., etc. Now let's look at one more little dynamic about braking that is very often overlooked. Besides getting more weight on the front tire, which gives you more grip because of the extra weight on the front tire, there's another dynamic going on, another phenomenon going on as you progressively increase the braking pressure. And it has to do with the tire itself. Now think about the compound of the tire. What would you think would be happening to the compound as you increase the drag, increase the load and the force and the weight on that tire? What the tire is actually doing now, the tire is getting warmer from the braking. And what does a warmer tire compound give us? The warmer compound, in turn, gives us even more traction. So as you're progressively increasing the brake pressure, you're increasing the weight on the tire, which gives you more traction, and you're getting the tire warmer and warmer, which gives you more traction. So now you can see all the dynamics are starting to work in your favor with a progressive braking force, as opposed to just all at once. If you do it progressively, you'd be surprised just how much aggressive brake force you can generate and still maintain control. But if you just try to do it all at once in one quick handful, you'll probably lock the front brake up long before you have the bike slowing down. Okay, as we've shown here, that with progressive braking, you can transfer more weight to the front tire, which gives you more grip to allow more braking. Also, as you're doing that, the tire is starting to get warmer, which gives you more grip, which allows you to use more braking. So progressive really works well. But there is one more side effect to progressive braking that a lot of people really don't think about. Once you've got all your braking done and you're all slowed down, it's your turning point, what have you got to use because of the aggressive braking you just did? You now have a nice warm front tire. And after your turning point, what's the next thing you're going to do? You're going to go slam this thing into a corner. But now, because of your braking techniques, you have a warm, sticky tire to rail into the corner with. If you're just using mediocre, mamby-pamby braking, you probably won't get the tire as warm as somebody that uses aggressive braking. That's why two riders, same tires, one rider can slam into a corner, no problem. Another guy goes in and just washes his front end out. It could come back to his braking techniques. Now let's look at one more little dynamic about braking that is very often overlooked. One more little side effect from good aggressive braking. Besides having a nice warm sticky tire to start your corner with, you also have a nice warm sticky tire if you plan to use trail braking, because it's better to have a warm tire to trail brake with than a cold one. So with proper aggressive braking, you get enough benefits that you can really carve up a corner. So far, we've seen the techniques to develop very aggressive braking techniques. Now, braking, as with everything else in the sport, there is a limit. There's an ultimate limit of friction and traction and suspension travel and all that. Even with proper braking techniques, you can reach and exceed. And if you exceed the limits of the motorcycle, that's generally when you fall down. So, what are the limits to aggressive braking? The first limit to aggressive braking is the overall front traction. If you apply way too much aggressive braking, you can easily lock up the front tire. Locking up the front tire while you're braking or at any time on the race course is not a good idea. But you want to be able to use the front brakes as aggressively as possible without locking the front end up. So how do you do that? Well, if you're progressively increasing the brake pressure, you'll slowly sneak up or progressively sneak up and work up to the point where the tire starts to break loose, which is real hard to do that. If you just grab a handful of brakes all at once, you can cross that threshold of friction real quickly. But if you're progressively increasing the brakes like we've been talking about, you won't suddenly hit where the tire breaks loose. You'll start to feel it gradually, little by little, breaking loose more and more. If you've got a good racing tire, up to temperature, proper pressure and all that stuff, yes. So what's the feedback to pay attention to so you can get to the edge of the tire's traction without crossing it? It's all in the handlebars. Most of us are familiar with how the handlebars feel when you're braking. If you're braking strongly and aggressively, you'll notice that the handlebars get very hard to turn right or left. But if the tire does start to slide, the handlebars turn easily, and it might even get to the point when the tire totally locks up, you get into a full cross up of the front wheel and down you go. But like I say, if you're progressively applying the brakes, you'll approach that threshold, and just as you start to approach the threshold, you'll feel the steering inputs lighten up just a little bit. And at that point, either you stop increasing the brake pressure or even slightly reduce it just a little bit to stay in margin of error. And there is a second limit to how hard you can finally apply the front brake. And it has to do with balance and weight transfer and all that. Depending on the bike and your center of gravity and how heavy it is and how good of a tire you got and how good the pavement is, there are situations where a racer could actually transfer 100% of the weight to the front wheel, have zero weight on the rear wheel, and the rear wheel actually leaves the ground and starts the race. You do a stoppie or a brakey or a reverse or wheelie, whatever you want to call it. Now, once again, progressive application and increase of pressure on the front brake will help you when you get to that point. If you're being progressive on the brakes, the wheel isn't going to just suddenly snap up in the air and all of a sudden you're standing way up on your nose. What will happen is you'll apply more and more front brake, the tire gets lighter and lighter in the back until it just starts to break the ground. You squeeze a little bit more, it leaves the ground a little bit farther, and you squeeze a little bit more, and finally away it goes. But just as the tire starts to leave the ground, there's another feedback. What you're going to feel is the back end is just going to start to wiggle and waggle around a little bit. It's not going to be a big bouncing and chattering all over the place. It's just going to be a little gentle waggle side to side as the tire starts to break the ground. Once you feel that, once again, either you stop applying more increasing brake pressure or you back off the brake pressure just a little bit to get the rear wheel back on the ground. And in that situation, a little note, I don't care what you do with the rear brake is ineffective when there's zero weight on the rear wheel. It will not re-weight the back end. So it's all with the front, paying attention to what's going on and paying attention to your brake pressure. But remember, it is this progressive application of the front brake which makes the whole thing work. You'll be able to be a lot more aggressive than you ever thought you could while maintaining control. One little important note to remember, where the key is still work up to it gradually. Don't make big sweeping changes in any of your techniques. Work up to it, small incremental changes, a little at a time. Okay, well, thank you for listening. Hope you picked up a few pointers too. Hope you can actually put some of this to use in your track riding. See you next time.